Thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrea Gowding, and I'm the Chief Financial Officer of Insurance Board. I'm happy to present our webinar today, Internal Controls for the Financial Operations of Ministries and Congregations. I also wanted to let you know that we have a chat feature, and we're happy to answer any questions or emails that might come up during today's presentation. Please let us know who's tuning in today and where you're from. We're interested to know your feedback as well as answer any questions. As we move through 2022 and into the future, now is a great time to revisit the internal controls of your ministries. For the last 2 years, things have been hectic, even chaotic. And right now, unfortunately, the current environment is a perfect mix for the opportunities for others to circumvent our internal controls. There's social pressures, economic downturn, political unrest, and uncertainty. We're also trying to operate both in a physical and virtual environment. So there's lots of moving pieces and unfortunately, lots of opportunities for others to take advantage of our congregations. So some goals of internal controls for your ministry would be, first off, to protect the assets of your ministry from misappropriation or fraud. Internal controls put procedures in place to quickly detect misstatements and to stop fraudulent activity. On the slide before, we talked about pressures that exist in our economic and social environment right now. Those pressures help to motivate, rationalize, and give others opportunities to misappropriate funds or mismanage things for our congregations. We may not be able to take away their motivation or even their rationalization. However, we do want to take away the opportunities, and that's what internal controls will help you do. In establishing good internal controls for your congregation, we're going to look at the fiduciary responsibilities and good stewardship of our assets. Internal controls will help us have sustainability and stabilization of our congregations, as well as increase the integrity and reliability of our records. That reliability, in turn, helps to make sure that there's a good audit trail or a path that others can recreate when they take a look at our accounting records. Our session objectives today would be a review of best practices for accounting and operational controls, and we're going to focus on cash cycles, including cash receipts and expenses. Please remember that the size of your congregation will dictate how those look for you and the best way that you can deploy that. I know we have larger and smaller congregations joining today, so please just consider how the information we're providing can be tailored best for your congregation. As we're also working within a virtual environment for many months now and will continue to do so, cybersecurity best practices will also be covered. We want to take a look at the best ways to protect your assets while you're navigating the internet or doing anything electronically. Asset protection is the key here, and we always want to consider the environment we're working in. Please also remember that the chat feature is up and going, and we're interested to hear your feedback as well as your questions. I mentioned earlier that we want to protect the assets of your congregation or ministry. Well, here are some ways that we can put that into action. We're going to establish policies and procedures to protect your ministry's assets. So we want to make sure that there's a written documentation of how items should be handled. More or less a cookbook, if you will, of how to handle differing transactions. This will help as you transition volunteers through different positions that perhaps they'll be helping with, as well as any new employees. If you can document what you want done, it's going to be easier for someone to follow along later. So some of the assets we'd like to protect would be the contributions we receive from our congregants. And we also want to make sure that in receiving those contributions, we use them and we properly utilize them for expenditures, valid expenditures for our congregations. By documenting our systems, we also serve to protect our employees and volunteers. We want what they do to be above reproach and to have the backing of solid policies and procedures behind them. One other asset that you'll be solidifying and protecting will be your reputation. We want to make sure that any contributions we receive are handled appropriately. We have reliable accounting records, and that goes a long way to help your donors know that what you're doing is appropriate and maintaining your reputation within the community. So now we know that we're going to put our players out on the field to do the best they can for us. So my question to you is, are they ready? Did you give them a background check to know exactly who's taking on these responsibilities? Are they skilled in the items that you would like them to be able to do for the congregation? And I'm asking you to give a second thought to the idea of trust or longevity as one of the main ways that you make sure your team's ready. Being in a position for a long time actually can serve as a detriment to your congregation, and solely relying on trust is not the way to bring your players to the field. Some of the key players for these internal controls will be your weekly cash counters, your bookkeeper and accountant, perhaps an office manager who handled the day-to-day operations. They may report up to a financial secretary or an accounting manager. And then in turn, that information is provided to the treasurer. We also may have a finance committee or an audit committee, as well as our board of trustees. One other aspect to good internal controls will also be your IT department. And we'll cover that a little bit later when we speak more about cybersecurity controls. So now we know who's on the team. And I just want to make sure that we realize that none of those players are an island unto themselves. We always want interaction between those layers. We want interaction for good oversight and review. That's going to be essential to know that those policies and procedures that you've taken the time to write out and document are being adhered to. So we always want to make sure that someone's basically looking over someone else's shoulders to make sure that a mistake wasn't made, let alone anything else. These internal controls are important no matter the size of your congregation. And once again, please take a look at how this can be tailored so that they are most applicable to your congregation. And once again, don't forget the chat feature. We're happy to answer any questions. And if there's something, if you stump us, don't worry, we'll get back to you on it. So I mentioned earlier that no one should be alone in their task, and there always should be good oversight and review. And now I'm going to share some claims lessons learned from actual claims that have been submitted to Insurance Board and that we've had to pay significant amounts of money out for, and that impacted their congregations through these claims. Unfortunately, we've had situations where a treasurer, accountant, or bookkeeper has been either a volunteer or an employee of a congregation and hasn't had proper oversight to their roles. In numerous cases, the individual has either cut checks to themselves and taken money. Perhaps they've mismanaged the credit card and utilized those for personal expenses. In another case, they actually put together a fictitious vendor and were cutting checks to this vendor that was actually going to their bank account as that vendor. And in all of these cases, unfortunately, the dollars that were taken were very significant to the congregation. So part of the internal controls that you'll be looking at is to make sure that certain situations such as those aren't going to be a situation that you'll be dealing with. And we want to consider the oversight, review, and also a good segregation of duties for how individuals are being allowed to handle tasks. And we'll get into that a little bit more now by discussing the types of controls. Some of the controls that you can put in place are considered preventative controls. And examples of these would be the approval of transactions, that are approved above a level of the individual initiating the transaction. We want to have proper segregation of duties so that each task to complete an accounting function is performed by a different person. We want to limit the access to certain aspects of our accounting systems and operations, such as checks, the systems, meaning your computers and anything else, firewalls, servers, as well as our donor lists. We also want to make sure that any tasks adhere to standard documentation that has been prescribed through our accounting or operational manuals. There are also a set of review controls that you can implement to make sure that someone is basically looking over the shoulders of those doing the work. A way to manage this for all your accounts would be reconciliations, making sure that we're taking a look at the activity and it balances in the manner that it should. Also, we should look at the bank statements on a monthly basis and make sure that those reconciliations are complete. We need to make sure that deposits are properly recorded, as well as any expenditures. We want to make sure that the review controls have varying levels of authority, perhaps based on the type of transaction or dollar value. We also want to make sure that there's a timely preparation of financials and the trial balance, and that those two items are prepared and then submitted to others for review. Additionally, you may call in an outside audit firm to complete an audit or review, or you may also set up volunteer teams or employee teams to do internal reviews of your transactions on a regular basis. One primary way that we receive contributions would be from our weekly offerings at service. And when we look at the cash counting internal controls, we want to make sure that we have specific controls in place. For example, there always should be 2 counters with who have the gifts in dual control at all times. If there are any checks, we want to immediately restrictively endorse those checks as for deposit only. When we put together our count teams, we want to make sure that no one is related on those count teams. We also want to make sure that the money is counted immediately following the service and deposited the day it is received. We need to use standardized forms so that then we can count the deposit and prepare a standardized form so that our bookkeeper or accountant knows how much will be deposited. We also want to implement the idea of receiving tamper-proof deposit bags from our bank and labeling those in advance so that our account teams have easy access to those, and also we know which bags they're using. We can put the date and the time of service on those bags, and it's easy to understand who's used what bag, and also to have an easy way to denote what the deposit is for. In looking at how our count teams conduct themselves, we also need to look at how maybe we can receive giving virtually or in a hybrid situation. One way to make sure that those deposits go directly to your bank is to institute contributions to be received electronically. There are different platforms that can fulfill this for your congregation, but one primary thing to consider is that they be PCI DSS compliant. The payment card industry that covers MasterCard, Visa, etc., has industry requirements for how cardholder data needs to be handled. They're very specific requirements, and they're not something that I would suggest that a church try to handle on their own. So you want to make sure that whatever service you might use for this is PCI DSS compliant. 3 that come to mind would be Zelle, Venmo, or Givelify. Please note that any of those contributions, as I mentioned earlier, will be reflected directly in your bank statement. So no one's handling it, and there's no possibility for misappropriation. One thing that sometimes holds congregations back would be the fees that are associated with employing one of these firms. I think it is best to view that as an investment and understand that you'll have an opportunity for congregants to give more regularly and at their convenience, so that those fees will more than make up for themselves. Now that your congregants have given so generously, we want to make sure that we close the loop with them through gift acknowledgements. Your congregation may consider sending quarterly statements to tell your congregants exactly how much they've given within the last 3 months. It's nice to add a personal note from the pastor and kind of individualize, perhaps if you know what that donor is interested in, to let them know that those gifts have been used in the manner in which they're interested, any kind of initiative that your congregation might have going on that they're supporting. It's also an opportunity to let them know of church news and maybe upcoming initiatives, and also a chance to add a statement that no goods or services were received in exchange for those donations. These gift acknowledgements can also serve as a reconciliation on the accounting side. To understand that those communications go out, it's also an opportunity to make sure that we've properly recorded and given credit to the appropriate donors in our records, and then those values are flowing correctly into our bank statement and then into our bank reconciliations, and subsequently to our cash accounts, to the amount that we're going to show on our balance sheet as cash. So it can serve a dual purpose, the gift acknowledgement. So now let's discuss the expense cycle. It's great that your donors have come through and been generous in their contributions to your congregation, but we want to make sure we handle those contributions in the best way possible. So as we're paying expenses, we want to make sure that we're matching vendor invoices with supporting documents. We want to pay off the invoice and not statements. So we want to make sure that the good or service has been received, and then we're going to pay directly from those invoices. I would suggest doing check runs on specific dates, and the individual who's tasked with putting the checks, running those checks, is not the same individual as those who will approve the check run and sign the checks. It is also a good suggestion to make sure that any new vendors who might show up in this check run be validated, and making sure that we've received a good or service from these new vendors. We want to make sure that they are not fictitious. Some additional items to concern yourself with in the expense cycle would be to make sure that any unused checks are locked up at all times. So we want to make sure that those are always under lock and key, and the access to those checks is limited to those who may need to access the checks for preparation. We also want to make sure that as we do a check run, if we're putting together checks 1 through 25, that we've accounted for 25 checks, and in the next check run that will begin at check 26. We don't want any missing checks out there, just to make sure that we're keeping track of all of the checks that we've cut in the appropriate way. If a check's voided, we just want to mark void on it and keep it within the batch so we know how that one was handled. We also want to take a look at the expenses that we incur for travel and meals, and to make sure that there's a policy that defines those and that we're only paying according to that policy. If you are going to pay for travel and meals or other expenses, we want to make sure that the expense reports are submitted in a timely manner and approved by that individual superior. And that might be on a monthly basis, or perhaps it's after the travel or trip is completed. Another way that we might be paying expenses these days is through credit cards. So we want to make sure that we're considering any of the expenses that have been charged to the congregation's card or the pastor's card if we're allowing utilization of a credit card for the pastor. We want to make sure that we receive a statement and review it and take a look to make sure that there are no personal expenses there. We also want to review any recurring charges. Perhaps we've set something up such as a subscription to hit our cards on a monthly basis. I guess questions for the team would be, are we still utilizing it? Is there a cheaper vendor for this service? So let's keep that always in review and not just assume because it was a recurring charge, we're not going to question it. We also want to make sure that the monthly statements from the credit card company are reviewed and approved prior to payment. Oftentimes the credit cards can be paid online, but we still want to make sure that we're reviewing these statements prior to that payment being made online. Over the last 2 years, we may have automated the manner in which we're paying some of our expenses. We might have automated these either through the credit cards that we discussed earlier, or perhaps by using ACH or wires to pay our vendors. We may also be using ACH or wires to move investments from perhaps contributions we've received that then need to go into a different fund. If you're utilizing ACH or wires, you need to make sure that the individual initiating that transaction is not the same individual who approves it. So we want to separate those two duties and make those to be the responsibility of two different individuals. We also want to make sure that anytime we're utilizing a banking transaction in that manner, we want to make sure that it's going to the appropriate vendor. So always double check the routing numbers, the ACH numbers, and the account numbers to make sure that it's going to be received by your vendor. I would also ask that you double check any emails or phone calls that you get that are asking for changes in banking data from your vendor. Unfortunately, we have seen claims that have popped up where there's been an email asking for a banking change or perhaps a phone call, and the church has trusted that information and unfortunately sent dollars to criminals. When this happens, it's really difficult to get those dollars back for them. So please double check those. And one easy way to do that, no matter how you receive the request, is to simply call back the vendor that you know and make sure that they did in fact make contact with you and ask for this change. So far we've presented some ideas for internal controls to make sure that the assets of your congregation are properly protected. An additional item that your congregation could put into place would be internal reviews. So in this situation, a group of 3 to 5 volunteers would get together and take a look at 2 months of activity that your accounting team has put together. They might review the deposits, checks, bank statements, expense reports to make sure that things are being handled in the manner that your accounting procedure manual has dictated, as well as anything with a travel policy. And that way you'll know that items are being handled in the manner that you'd expect. These internal reviews would take a look, like I said, for errors or corrections, as well as adhering to your policies and procedures. We'd also like them to summarize the results. And whereas you might find an error here or there, we also want them to find positive aspects to what your team's done. So please be sure to ask for those as well when they summarize their results. Any recommendations can then be brought to the accounting team and then also discussed with either the finance committee or perhaps the audit committee of your board of trustees. Now, we've spoken about internal reviews that could be handled by volunteers of your congregation, but there's a further step your congregation can take by having an external audit or review completed by an external CPA firm. Now, there's a cost associated with this. So depending on the volume of your transaction and the size of your congregation, this may or may not be a good way to go. Audits are conducted typically on an annual basis, but you may choose to do this every other year, and reviews much in the same way. The big differentiator between audits and reviews is the opinion that one receives for the work that they do. Audits are more intense, and there's a greater selection of transactions and the volume of transactions that your auditors would look at. Reviews don't go into that depth, so their opinion isn't as specific. However, either one can provide your donors with confidence that the assets are being handled appropriately. Oftentimes, audits or reviews are dictated if you have a banking relationship and perhaps a line of credit. Oftentimes, they come into play then. But it might not be a bad idea for the congregation to investigate an external CPA firm taking on those responsibilities for you, just to make sure things are as you're expecting them to be. Cybersecurity controls. So I'm not sure how you're watching us today. Maybe it's on your PC or your tablet, or perhaps even your phone. But what you should know is that however you're connected to us, and we're happy you're here, you are one of over 50 billion devices currently connected to the internet. And on each of those devices, there's plenty of data to mine and exploit by malicious users. These users are very opportunistic, and they just want to go to the easiest target possible. So as we walk through these cybersecurity controls, the goal is to make sure that your congregation is not an easy target, and that we've put up a good fence to keep those criminals away. One thing to consider as we discuss these, please realize that these opportunistic criminals are not considering the fact that you're a church. They are coming after churches, hospitals, and not-for-profits on a daily basis. So I don't want anyone to think, well, we're a church, no one would dare. No, they're coming for all of us. And I think their exploits are only getting more difficult to manage. So let's get some cybersecurity controls going for you so that you are not the easy target. Some specific cybersecurity threats that you should be aware of are ransomware and social engineering. Ransomware is the deployment of malicious software that blocks your access to your computer system until a sum of money is paid. It basically denies users access by encrypting your own files. Social engineering takes on the guise of the opportunity of emails that attempt to acquire sensitive data through fraudulent emails. And that can be through phishing or spear phishing. Spear phishing is when the criminal tries to tailor those emails so that it appears to come from a trusted source. Phishing remains the top attack vector for ransomware. So these two things work together in a nefarious way to allow cyber criminals access to your system. In fact, according to Allied World Insurance, a new organization will fall victim to ransomware every 11 seconds. So the threats are persistent, and they're very important to consider as you operate. So as you look at cybersecurity and the best way to protect yourselves, you're going to have to make investments. And the first big investment you'll need to make is employee training. We want to make sure that our employees aren't clicking on any attachments or links that come through emails unless they know it's a valid email. We want to make sure they're not giving out any data from your congregants to any outside sources. We need the employees, even though it's lovely that so many of our employees are trusting people, we want to make them skeptical when they're in the arena of cybersecurity. We want to make sure that they won't be taken advantage of. So they need to always double check where the email is coming from and to double check the extension on that email, because so many fraudulent emails appear to be from a known or trusted vendor, colleague, but we want to make sure that we're always double checking those. When we spoke about ransomware, it's understood that you wouldn't have access to your own system. Well, one way to make sure that that can be avoided is to get sufficient backup procedures and perhaps multiple backups of your data. There's opportunities for this data to be stored in the cloud and also physically. If you're storing it physically, you want to make sure that those backups don't remain on site at your church, but that are stored elsewhere. We also want to make it tougher for these criminals to access our system in any way. So when we want to put up appropriate firewalls. An additional way to make sure that we're protected from these criminals would be to make sure that any network and software updates are done on a timely basis. Unfortunately, when patches aren't deployed, criminals have often found certain ways that they can exploit really good software out there. And if we don't patch appropriately, there's an opportunity for them to, let's say, come in through an open window. Additional items to consider for cybersecurity would be to establish IT policies and recovery plans. You want to make sure that those are documented and adhered to. Those are also good to review on an annual basis to make sure that they're still up to snuff for the new threats that might appear. We want to make sure that we have antivirus protection on each computer and server. We want to make sure that all devices have individual passwords that are complex and at least 8 to 15 characters long. That may sound like something very difficult to manage, but there are password keepers out there such as LastPass, Dashlane, and Keeper that can store your passwords and make it much simpler to have a more complex password available to you. When we're looking at Wi-Fi, we want to make sure that our Wi-Fi that we're utilizing for operations is not accessible to our congregants or to any third parties that might come on site. Perhaps they're using a meeting room or a vendor comes on site. We want to make sure that we always keep our Wi-Fi network separate from what we allow congregants or third parties to use. Cybersecurity controls are extremely important. And we also want to always make sure that we know who we're dealing with when we're in the cyber world. There was an incident at a church, one that we don't insure, thankfully, where they were having a building campaign and they actually were putting up a structure. Unfortunately, and everyone knew the contractor, they knew what was going on, they knew that they were being billed appropriately or periodically from this contractor. Unfortunately, a bad actor was able to infiltrate their systems. They watched quietly what was going on and were aware of the building being built by the church. So they then sent over fictitious invoices that were then paid by the church, and they also changed the banking information. So while the church is thinking they're properly paying their contractor, they were actually paying these cyber criminals. And the fraud was eventually figured out when the contractor was looking for payment, and the church was thinking that they were up to date and had paid the contractor appropriately. So we always just want to be a little skeptical when we're dealing with anything that we send money out the door and to new individuals, new vendors. So, but let's end this on a positive note. So we actually also receive information from our insureds where cyber controls and internal controls came to the rescue. And here's one to share with you. Church secretary received an email from the senior pastor requesting that his banking information be changed for a new direct deposit. The email had all the information the secretary would need, and it looked to appear to come directly from the senior pastor's work email. Church secretary sent this off to the payroll department, but the payroll department, with their sharp eyes, sent it over to IT. IT then took a look at it and realized that it was a fraudulent email and actually came from a criminal, and no change was made to the senior pastor's direct deposit. So that was a good eye to the payroll department, and thankfully IT also stepped in. So those controls can all work together to help your congregations. So once again, if there's any questions for what was presented today, don't forget about the chat feature. It's not too late. And also, we're going to ask that for additional information on this topic, please go to insuranceboard.org and click on our Safety Central tab, where you can find additional resources for both financial and cybersecurity tools. Thanks for joining us today. I hope you learned a lot, and please don't forget to submit any questions, or feel free to email us at Insurance Board for any further questions you may have.